Ever wonder, like, what makes some societies just thrive while others, totally fall apart?
Oh, yeah. It's a question that's been around forever, right?
It really has. And today we're looking at it from a really fascinating perspective, that of Mohammed Shahrour.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so you, our amazing listeners, you flagged this super thought-provoking YouTube discussion about his book, The State and Society: The Destruction of Villages and the Flourishing of Cities.
Okay, I see where we're going with this.
Yeah, and what we're going to do today is try to distill, like, Shahrour's core insights on how societies, work, but through the lens of the Quran, which is really interesting. So think of this as your, like, express lane to understanding some pretty profound stuff.
I like it. An express lane. Definitely needed sometimes.
For sure. So can you tell us a little bit about Mohammed Shahrour for those who might not be familiar with him?
Absolutely. So Mohammed Shahrour he was a Syrian civil engineer, actually.
Oh, wow. Interesting background.
Right. But he became like a really influential thinker on the Quran. And this book came out pretty shortly before he passed away in 2019.
Oh, wow.
It was kind of seen as his last big intellectual statement. And one of the things that really stands out about his work is this idea that the Quran, like, it's not stuck in a single historical interpretation. He really believed it was a universal message that speaks to all times,
A timeless kind of message. Yeah, that makes sense.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's get into the book itself. The title, The Destruction of Villages and the Flourishing of Cities.
Yeah, it's a very striking title, right?
It is. It's like immediately you get that sense of contrast. And he's using village and city metaphorically, right?
Absolutely. So the village for him represents stagnation, kind of like being stuck. And then the city is all about progress, development, moving forward.
I see. Okay. And where does the Quran come into this whole picture?
So his whole analysis is actually grounded in these two key verses from Surah Al-Isra. The first one talks about how, a community can fall apart when the wealthy people, the affluent, start acting unjustly and corruptly. But it's the second verse that Shahrour really focuses on. It basically says that every community is going to face some kind of destruction or really serious punishment before the day of judgment. And he sees this statement as being like, inscribed in the book, like a fundamental law of how societies work.
Wow. So like a natural law for societies to, rise and fall.
Exactly. But understood, through this Quranic perspective.
That is really powerful. The YouTube discussion you shared also mentions some connections to thinkers like Ibn Khaldun, Toynbee, Fukuyama. It seems like Shahrour's kind of like engaging with these big historical theories, but he's grounding his understanding in the Quran.
You got it. That's a really important point. He's saying this law, this societal law, it's not limited to, any particular religion or belief system. It's a universal principle.
Okay, so it applies to everyone, everywhere.
Exactly. And what's even more interesting is how he defines a village.
Oh, how so?
It goes beyond just a physical place, right? For Shahrour, a village represents any group of people, conscious, rational individuals who share similar patterns of behavior. And when those behaviors when they start to be defined by injustice, like rejecting the good that's available to them or different forms of tyranny, that village, that societal structure, it becomes self-destructive.
Yeah.
And that destruction can come from within the society itself or from external pressures, like colonialism.
It's more about the mindset, the actions of the people than the actual location. Makes sense.
Yeah. It's about the patterns that emerge from the group,
Now, in the discussion, they brought up some pretty compelling examples that Shahrour uses to illustrate this.
Oh, yeah.
Like post-World War I Germany under Hitler.
Ah, right. With that single imposed ideology.
Exactly. And the Soviet Union's collapse. They attributed that to the Communist Party's tight control after the 1917 revolution. Both of those, in Shahrour's view, would be examples of villages.
Definitely. He contrasts these with societies that are more pluralistic, like the United States, for example.
Okay.
His argument is that when you have diverse viewpoints, even if there's a tendency to become more uniform during a crisis, that internal friction, that debate, it actually makes the society more resilient.
It's like that saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is that Shahrour's main goal with all of this is to encourage critical thinking, especially within Arab societies. He's warning against the dangers of, staying stuck in intellectual and political uniformity for too long. He saw it as a huge obstacle to progress.
Okay, so moving away from that restrictive village mentality is key to achieving real progress.
That's exactly it. You have to embrace the diversity of the city approach if you want a society to truly flourish.
So to kind of recap some of Shahrour's main ideas here, he's presenting this perspective on societal change as a fundamental law, almost like a law of nature, but seen through a Quranic lens.
Right. And he uses these powerful metaphors of the village and the city.
Yeah, the village representing stagnation and the city representing, progress and development. And this idea that intellectual and political uniformity, like the village mentality, is a real danger.
And on the flip side, embracing pluralism, development, like the city approach, that's crucial for societies to survive and thrive.
Okay, so he's not just pointing out problems, he's also offering potential solutions, or at least paths forward.
Exactly. But he doesn't stop there. He also tackles this question of why he thinks some Muslim societies haven't progressed as much as one might expect, considering these Quranic principles.
Ah, that's an interesting point. So what does he say about that?
Well, he critiques what he sees as a tendency to elevate the actions of early Muslims to the level of dogma, something that can't be questioned.
I see.
And he feels like that can hinder progress because you need to be able to critically reevaluate things in light of new challenges.
Right. It's like saying we can't just copy and paste solutions from the past onto the present.
Exactly. He also points to an overemphasis on the caliphate in some interpretations. Sometimes at the expense of more universal human values that he believes the Quran emphasizes.
Interesting. So it's about finding that balance.
Right. And, the discussion also mentioned Shahrour's views on rulers throughout history.
Oh, right. What about that?
He felt like the traditional way rulers are portrayed often doesn't really capture the dynamics of power and how easily it can be misused,
Yeah, power can be a tricky thing.
It really can. And what Shahrour really wanted was for contemporary scholars, people studying this today, to take a fresh critical look at Islamic social theory. He urged them to move beyond just relying on, Western intellectual frameworks or very strict traditional interpretations, like Salafi interpretations, for example.
Okay, and why do you think he felt that was so important?
Well, he felt like sometimes those very rigid interpretations can actually stifle contemporary thought and progress. It's like you need some breathing room for new ideas to emerge.
I got it. So, to shift gears a little bit, in Shahrour's view, how can societies actually avoid this whole destruction of the village thing? The discussion kept coming back to this idea of internal debate.
Yeah, he really emphasizes that. For him, critical self-reflection and open debate within a society, that's key to its well-being. You can't be afraid to question things, to challenge the status quo.
It's about having those difficult conversations, right?
Absolutely. And he also brings up the idea of tyranny, but he defines it really broadly.
Broadly, in what sense?
It's not just political oppression, right? He sees tyranny in ideological forms, social forms, intellectual, even economic.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So this multifaceted tyranny, that's a defining feature of the village mindset, and he argues that it's a major driver of societal collapse.
Interesting. So tyranny can take many forms, not just the obvious ones.
Precisely. And, he often uses the Quranic story of Pharaoh as a warning, like a classic example of what happens when power becomes too concentrated and unchecked.
Yeah, that makes sense. Pharaoh is like the archetype of the tyrant.
Exactly.
Now, the discussion also delved into Shahrour's views on how societies evolve, starting from the individual and the family unit. What did he have to say about that?
Well, he talks about the development of family structures and ethical frameworks and how they've evolved from, a simpler state to the complexity of modern society. And he always connects this back to Quranic principles.
Okay, so he sees a clear link between the Quran and the evolution of societies.
Absolutely. He also makes this really interesting distinction between instinct and conscious desire. He argues that those are the forces that drive human development, and that's what sets us apart from, from creatures that are purely instinct-driven, like insects, for example.
Humans are definitely more complex than insects.
Right. And yet another key point he makes is about the difference between natural death and what he calls intarsha, which is destruction.
Okay, so how are those different?
Natural death is, well, it's natural, right? But tarsha is more than just decline. It's the active undoing of the social fabric by constantly violating those ethical and moral principles that are necessary for a healthy society. It's like a self-inflicted wound.
So it's not just about fading away, it's about actively undermining the very foundation of a society.
Exactly. It's like a society destroying itself from within because it's ignoring those fundamental principles.
That's a pretty stark way to put it.
It is, but it really highlights the seriousness of the issue,
So if Shiraz is this kind of self-destruction, what does Shahrour propose as a way to move away from that path? The discussion ended by really emphasizing freedom and democracy.
Right. Those are absolutely central to his vision. He sees freedom and democratic consultation, what's often called shura, not just as, practical tools for governing, but as the fundamental way for societies to decide their own direction.
So people need to have a say in how their society is run.
Exactly. And he even points to, the prophet's interactions with his community. Even though he had divine guidance, he still emphasized consultation and respecting people's freedom to choose their own beliefs.
Okay, so it's about giving people agency, even in a divinely guided context.
Right. It's about recognizing that people have the right to make their own choices, even when it comes to their beliefs.
It sounds like Shahrour is offering a really powerful framework for understanding why some societies do well and others don't, all rooted in his interpretation of the Quran. And it definitely challenges a lot of conventional thinking.
Oh, for sure. And, I think one of the most important points he makes is right at the end.
Oh, what's that?
He's worried that people might dismiss his ideas as being too idealistic or, too abstract, and then they'll just stay stuck in those cycles of stagnation and outdated beliefs.
So he's concerned about people not taking action because they think it's all just a pipe dream.
Exactly. He wants people to see that these ideas can actually lead to real change if they're willing to embrace them.
And that brings us to the question for you, our listener, to consider. Do Shahrour's ideas still resonate today? Can we use his framework to understand the problems we're facing in the world right now?
Right, think about it. How do these metaphors of the village and the city play out in our lives today?
And maybe even more importantly, how willing are we to question our own assumptions and beliefs? If we really want to see progress, if we truly want to flourish, maybe a little bit of critical reevaluation is what we need. It's definitely something to think about.
I think so, too. It's always good to challenge our own perspectives.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for listening, everyone.
And keep those questions coming.
We'll be back next week with another deep dive.
See you then.